What do we know about the life of Thomas Boleyn, father of Anne Boleyn, and was he a bad dad who pushed both his daughters into the bed of Henry VIII in order to gain power through them, or has his reputation been horribly maligned in the centuries since his death? This week on History Calling, I provide you with a biography of this rather overlooked character, including his marriage, his occupation, his rise at court, his attitude to his daughter's affairs with Henry, what it was like to be the father-in-law of the king, how he reacted to the fall and execution of his daughter Anne and son George, what we know about the last time he saw his granddaughter Elizabeth, and his own death and burial. Thomas Boleyn was born in around 1476 or 1477, most likely in Blickling in Norfolk. His parents, who had married by 1475 at the latest, were Sir William Boleyn and Margaret Butler, daughter and co-heir of the 7th Earl of Ormond. Thomas was the eldest surviving child from a large family of at least 11 children, though 3 died young. Relatively little is known about his youth, but the Boleyns were wealthy, and we can make some assumptions based on his rank and later career. He was evidently well educated, taught to read and write, speak French and Latin, ride and use a sword, and he was, of course, raised a Catholic. One of the first glimpses we get of him is in June 1497, when he was present, along with his father, at a rising in southern England during which he fought on behalf of King Henry VII to put the rebels down. At some point within the next couple of years, he was also married to Lady Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Earl of Surrey. The couple appear to have lived initially at Blickling, and according to a much later letter, times were somewhat tough, for Thomas recalled in 1536 that, "When I married, I had only £50 a year to live on for me and my wife as long as my father lived." William Boleyn died in October 1505, "and yet she brought me every year a child." Of all the children they would have, only 3 survived to make any real impression upon history. They were Mary, born in around 1499, Anne, born in roughly 1500 or 1501, and George, born in around 1504. We know the names of 2 others thanks to memorials to them. They were Henry, listed as the son of Sir Thomas Boleyn and commemorated in Hever Church with a cross which dates to around 1520, and a younger Thomas whose gravestone with a cross on it was placed about 3 miles away at Penshurst in Kent, and who was again listed as the son of Sir Thomas Boleyn. As Thomas Sr. only became a knight in 1509, that child must have died in that year or later, if we assume that the grave marker was not placed sometime afterwards. Speaking of memorials, the only known image we have of Thomas comes from the memorial brass on his own tomb, which shows him with slightly wavy hair, which came down to his lip line, a long face and very pointed chin, hands clasped in prayer, and dressed in the order of the Garter robes and armour. There is a jewelled cap on his head, and his feet are resting on a griffin. How accurate the image is, we'll never know. Although a Hans Holbein sketch, labelled as the Earl of Ormond, is often referred to as him, this is in fact an error, and I have an entire episode explaining how I know that and why the story that another Holbein image, often referred to as his son George, is also inaccurate. I'll leave it linked below for you. In between producing all these children, Thomas was also building a name for himself at court. He was present at the wedding of Prince Arthur Tudor to Catherine of Aragon in 1501, and in 1503 he accompanied Princess Margaret Tudor to Scotland for her marriage to King James IV. At some point, the growing family relocated to the beautiful Hever Castle, probably after William Boleyn died. As we've seen, Thomas, who was by now an esquire of the body to the new king, Henry VIII, having performed the same duty for Henry VII at the end of his reign, was made a Knight of the Bath at the coronation celebrations for Henry VIII in June 1509. He then rode in the coronation procession, decked out in purple velvet for the occasion. Other honours quickly followed, including being made Keeper of the Foreign Exchange in England, Keeper of the Exchange in Calais, then still under English control, and Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk. There were court functions to take part in too, including a revel at Westminster for the Queen, Catherine of Aragon, in January 1510, during which Thomas, the King, and 10 others dressed up like Robin Hood. Jousts followed in the spring and summer, and when Catherine was delivered of a son on New Year's Day 1511, Thomas was one of those who took part in the celebratory jousts the following month. Sadly, though, that little prince lived only 7 weeks, and you can hear all about this lost Tudor heir in my episode on his life, which is linked below for you. Thomas was one of those who acted as a mourner at the baby's funeral, helping to carry the little coffin. By the early 1510s, Sir Thomas Boleyn had amassed a solid income and portfolio of land grants from the king, and a place at court as an apparently favoured attendant. Now, though, his career increasingly became that of a diplomat. He was appointed as an ambassador and sent to meet with Margaret of Austria, then the regent of the Low Countries, and her father, Emperor Maximilian, in 1512. The trip ran into the following year and resulted in the enlargement of the anti-French Holy League to include England, the Pope, Maximilian, and Margaret. It would prove a pivotal moment in the life of Thomas and his daughter Anne, for having made this valuable connection and a favourable impression upon Margaret, he was able to send the girl to live with her in Mechlin, most likely in the summer of 1513, and almost certainly as a lady-in-waiting. There Anne would be able to improve her French and learn court etiquette. It was quite the coup to get such a position for her, as Anne would be living alongside the likes of the future Charles V of Spain, and it shows how much Thomas was willing to invest in his daughter's education, with the intention being that she be ready for a position in the English court when she returned. That same year, Thomas accompanied the king when he went on campaign in France and won the Battle of the Spurs. Soon, though, the wheels of international diplomacy turned again, and France was to be the new ally. Henry sent his sister, the beautiful and teenage Princess Mary, to marry the ageing Louis XII at the end of 1514, and Thomas managed to get both his daughters included in the princess's household. Mary Boleyn travelled with her from England, as did Thomas, and Anne was brought over from Margaret's court. The wedding took place on the 9th of October, and Thomas was present for it. When the king died less than 3 months later, Mary Boleyn would return home with the Dowager Queen of France, who had swiftly remarried to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, while Anne stayed on to wait on the new queen, Claude. Thomas had managed to get her a place in the premier court in Europe. Back in England, his career continued to go from strength to strength, and when his maternal grandfather, the Earl of Ormond, died in 1515, the possibility opened up for Thomas to receive that earldom himself. As the son of the deceased Earl's second daughter, though, his claim wasn't strong, and the title was in any case immediately claimed by a distant cousin, Piers Butler. Boleyn would not give up his assertion that the earldom was his, though, and the dispute over who should hold it would last for years. Now, in case you weren't aware, Ormond is an Irish title, and so this seems like a good time to say that if you have Irish ancestry, as the Boleyns did, you might like to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, which is available as an ebook or paperback from Amazon and is linked below for you. While the issues with the Ormond earldom carried on in the background, Thomas had other things to distract him. He was present at the baptism of Princess Mary on the 20th of February 1516. This was Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon's daughter, not to be confused with the king's sister of the same name, and held the canopy over the baby. Then the following year, when Margaret Tudor, now Queen of Scotland, visited England, he acted as her carver for 6 weeks. He was also given positions in local government, including being made the Sheriff of Kent in 1517, but he remained useful in an ambassadorial and foreign policy role. He was one of the witnesses to the Treaty of Universal Peace made between the French and English in October 1518, and may have been on the Privy Council by that date. Within weeks, he was named an ambassador to France, and he seems to have set off for the court of Francis I in November, where his daughter Anne was still living, though the first definite evidence we have of his presence in that country dates to January 1519. The trip kept him out of England for over a year, and in the spring of 1519 he represented Henry VIII as godfather at the baptism of the French king's new son, who was also called Henry, or rather Henri as the French would say, and was the Duke of Orleans, later becoming Henry II. Whilst in France, he had the job of helping to organise the famous Field of the Cloth of Gold, the meeting between Kings Henry and Francis, which took place in Calais in 1520. However, he did not see this task through to completion, as he was replaced as ambassador in February that year and left in March. The reasons for this change are unclear, but a few have been suggested. William Dean speculated in his PhD thesis on Thomas, which was one of my secondary sources for this video, that it may have had something to do with how close he was to the French royal family and to Margaret of Austria, all of whom had taken in his daughter Anne after all, or that his personality was too cautious for this job, though actually a cautious personality is exactly what you want in an ambassador. There was also the fact that Thomas had now been out of England for over a year and may have wanted to go home to see his family, excepting Anne, and tend to his estates and other business. He had been annoyed too at having lost out on the position of comptroller of the royal household during his absence, writing to King Henry's chief minister Thomas Wolsey to complain about it in 1519, and it is interesting that he did finally get that position in 1520 once he was home. Maybe he was happy enough to get back and find preferment in a different area of royal service. Back in England, he had to contend with the marriage of his daughter Mary to William Carey, which had taken place a few weeks prior in February 1520. Apparently, Thomas wasn't happy about this union. Carey wasn't much of a catch, even though it was approved of by the king who had attended the nuptials, but there was nothing he could do about it. Even aside from this issue, Mary was turning out to be something of a disappointment. She had gained a reputation in France for being a woman of loose morals, shall we say, and she is of course best remembered for being the mistress of Henry VIII before his attention turned to her sister. We don't know when this affair occurred though. Possibly it dated to before her marriage, but it seems more likely to date to the years immediately following it. Henry's mistress in 1518 and 1519 was Bessie Blunt, mother of his son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, who was born in 1519, and Mary's children weren't born until the 1520s, the assumption being that if she'd been sleeping with Henry VIII in the 1510s, when he clearly had no problem getting women pregnant, as Catherine of Aragon and Bessie's conception history show, she'd have likely conceived herself. Grants to her husband starting in 1522 also suggest that this is when she became the royal mistress, but academic opinion is split on the matter. Whatever the answer, she certainly wasn't showing herself to be the demure, obedient, God-fearing 16th century lady that her father would have wanted her to be. And considering the efforts he had gone to provide her with opportunities to work in a royal household, I have no problem imagining he was disappointed in and exasperated by her. Still, she was nevertheless included on the Boleyn family trip to attend the Field of the Cloth of Gold, and on the 31st of May 1520 they set off for Calais, Thomas in his role as a diplomat and his wife and daughter in the household of Catherine of Aragon. Anne, of course, was already in France with Queen Claude, and young George was presumably about too. Even one of Thomas's brothers and his wife were present. This famous royal summit began on the 7th of June and finished on the 23rd, and Thomas returned home. Once there, it was time to think about how to deal with a suggested marriage for his daughter Anne. This brings us back to the ongoing dispute over the Ormond earldom. The plan to try to solve this issue, which was put forward by Thomas's brother-in-law, the Earl of Surrey, who was then the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, was to marry Anne off to Piers Butler's son and heir, James Butler, thus combining the two claims to the title. It is James, in fact, who appears in the Holbein sketch so often wrongly identified as Thomas. Thomas doesn't seem to have been terribly keen on the idea. It would prevent him from getting the earldom after all, though Wolsey, in whose household young James Butler was living, was still pursuing it as late as January 1522. It ultimately came to nothing, but it does seem to have been the impetus behind the decision to bring Anne back to England at the end of 1521, where she was placed in the household of Catherine of Aragon. She wasn't the only one moving up in English royal circles. It was at around the same time, in late 1521 or early 1522, that Thomas finally got a promotion he had long wanted, to Treasurer of the Household for Henry, and it seems likely that it was at around this time that Mary Boleyn became the monarch's mistress and possibly mother to one or two of his children, although that theory is heavily debated and we're never going to know for sure if her offspring were her husband's or the king's. Throughout all of this, Thomas had continued in his ambassadorial role. He went to France with Wolsey in August 1522, ostensibly to negotiate peace between Spain and France, though really England was essentially in cahoots with Emperor Charles V at this point at King Francis's expense, and he would stay there until the end of November. A later mission to go as ambassador to Spain nearly ended in disaster, when the ship he was on ran aground near Falmouth, and some of those he travelled with drowned. When they set out again, they were attacked by 6 Breton ships and only narrowly escaped with their lives, before finally making it to their destination on the 11th of October, 1522. Yet again, he would be away from home for an extended period of time, not arriving back until June 1523. Let's pause at this juncture to think about Thomas's personality. He was clearly a clever man with a good work ethic, who did inherit money and property, but who was also prepared to graft hard to get more. A kind of 15th or 16th century Nepo baby, if you will, though really that could be said about much of the aristocracy. His ambitions weren't limited to what he could earn either, as his determination to get the earldom of Ormond shows, for his claim on it really was quite wobbly. We can also see his can-do attitude in his approach to advancement in the royal household. Remember that he had written to complain to Thomas Wolsey in 1519, for instance, about the fact that he had been overlooked for the position of comptroller of the household, as he said that Henry VIII had insinuated to him back in 1515 that he would get this post when it next became available. So he was prepared to be his own advocate and wasn't scared of making complaints and asking favours from the person who was then the second most powerful man in the land. As for his main job as an ambassador, in this he seems to have been very competent, and it is to his credit that Henry VIII continued to give him plum positions like ambassador to France for many years. As well as his linguistic talents, Thomas was evidently someone who could gain the confidence of those he worked with. Margaret of Austria liked him so well that she was prepared to take his daughter into her household, and Francis I told Henry VIII that Thomas's conduct at the baptism of the Duke of Orleans was excellent, and he acquitted himself, quote, with all possible honour. Louise of Savoy, mother of King Francis, also wrote of him in glowing terms upon his departure from France. Back to the early to mid-1520s, however. Anne was working away in Queen Catherine's household, having an undated dalliance with Henry Percy, future Earl of Northumberland, to which we don't really know how Thomas reacted. In 1523 he was made a Knight of the Garter, and in 1525, directly after the king's illegitimate son had been made Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Thomas was raised to the rank of Viscount Rochford, with several other men being made peers at the same ceremony. Now, whether this was a nod to the fact that his daughter Mary was the king's mistress, or a reward for his own hard work for the Tudors over the preceding 25 years, is up for debate. Though I would lean towards the latter option, as Henry was not then known for remunerating his mistresses' families to this degree. It certainly comes too early in the timeline to be connected to Anne's future relationship with the king. That would only begin, as far as we can tell, the following year. Now we get to the area in which Thomas is, I think, so frequently misrepresented by modern historical fiction, and that is his involvement in Anne and Henry's relationship and his attitude to it. Henry had by now given up hope of getting a son from Catherine of Aragon, and his ardour for her had evidently cooled. He'd had an affair with one Boleyn sister, which I actually can't imagine Thomas was happy about, as it further damaged Mary's reputation and by extension her family's, and brought them little in the way of preferment, and now the king's attention was caught by the other, a woman who'd been working in the royal household for around 4 years by this point. Watch or read something like The Tudors or The Other Boleyn Girl, and you could be forgiven for thinking that Thomas engineered his two daughters' activities with the king in an attempt to get preferment from him. But as I've said, Henry wasn't known for greatly favouring his mistresses' relations, except maybe their husbands, and Thomas was already a viscount and a wealthy man by this stage. Nor could anyone have possibly foreseen in 1526 that if Henry abandoned Catherine, he would break with the church in Rome to marry an Englishwoman instead of seeking another foreign alliance. In actual fact, the evidence we have suggests that the new Viscount Rochford was hostile to Anne's burgeoning relationship with this married man, either for reasons of conscience, this was hardly following biblical rules for example, because it distressed him to see his two daughters ruined and by the same man, or because he worried about where it would all end. He'd known the king and known him well for many years after all. He knew Henry was a flake who was frequently cheating on his wife and discarding the objects of his affection shortly afterwards. The evidence in question is going to require me to jump forward in time for a few minutes, as it comes from letters written by the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis to Charles V of Spain several years later in 1533, after Anne had married Henry and was pregnant with Elizabeth I. If Chapuis' information was true, it indicates how strong Thomas's initial objections to the match were. It was apparently only in 1533 that he declared himself, meaning showed himself in favour of the union, which was by then a fait accompli, for apparently at some time before that he had, quote, rather dissuaded the king from it than otherwise. This was according to Chapuis' source, who was Thomas's brother-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk, too, has been presented more recently as one of the masterminds behind the union, but he himself said in May 1533, the week of Anne's coronation, that he had not been a promoter of the marriage, but had always dissuaded it, and had it not been for him and her father, who pretended to be mad to have better means of opposing this marriage, it would have been done secretly a year ago, on which account the lady was very indignant against both of them. Chapuis went on to say in the same letter that, in confirmation of this, I have learned from a very good authority, and from one who was present, that 8 days since, the lady, having to put in a piece to enlarge her gown, as ladies do when in the family way, her father told her she ought to take it away, and thank God to find herself in such condition. And she, in presence of Norfolk, Suffolk, and the treasurer of the household, replied by way of announcement that she was in better condition than he would have desired. So Thomas had apparently feigned madness at one point to try to prevent Anne's marriage to Henry, and she knew that her condition as the pregnant Queen of England, married to a man whose first wife was still living, was not one he had initially sought for her. Still, her complaints may have related to things Thomas had said and done several years earlier. They don't necessarily mean that he was against the marriage as late as 1533. Nevertheless, the result was that their father-daughter relationship was rather strained, with their spats breaking out even in front of witnesses, and Anne was no fan of her uncle Norfolk either for similar reasons. Furthermore, Norfolk would once describe Thomas as timid and not warlike, hardly the personality traits we would associate with a man willing to risk it all by conniving to get his daughter, and expected grandchildren, a crown. Whatever his private feelings about it, Thomas had obviously never really been able to stop this liaison once Henry's heart was set on Anne, and in the years between 1527 and 1533 he had actually gained a great deal by it and took actions to support it. At the trial of the Aragon marriage in 1529, he gave testimony that he had been at the wedding of Prince Arthur and Catherine in 1501, and had been present the next day to hear Arthur claim to have sealed the deal with his wife on their wedding night, something which, if true, would have greatly strengthened Henry's case for an annulment, but which Catherine always denied. I'll leave my episode all about whether they really did sleep together linked for you. That same year, Thomas also obtained his long-held desire to become the Earl of Ormond, being ennobled as the Earl of Wiltshire at the same time so that he would have an English title too. From here on out, he would be called Wiltshire, whilst his son George would be known by his father's now subsidiary title of Viscount Rochford. The Boleyns seem to be rising far and fast, with the notable exception of Mary. Her husband, William Carey, had died of the sweating sickness in June 1528. Thomas and Anne had both been ill with it too at Hever, and her father, who had apparently completely fallen out with her by this point, had to be ordered by Henry VIII to support the now destitute widow, showing a far from attractive streak in his character. Why the father-daughter bond was so broken at this stage is unclear, but perhaps Thomas continued to be unhappy at some of Mary's life choices, most especially who she went to bed with and married. Concurrent with all of this was the downfall of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, as he proved unable to obtain an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine from the Pope. As early as 1527, it was noted that it was with Thomas Boleyn, his brother-in-law Norfolk, and Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, that the king usually ate, with Thomas constantly in attendance on the monarch. Though he had previously worked with Wolsey, the two's relationship quickly soured as the issue of the king's great matter, as the annulment was known, progressed. Wolsey even berated Thomas at one point during the 1529 trial, warning him that the idea of ditching Catherine with papal approval and marrying Anne was a fantasy, and that Boleyn and the others who supported the marriage to Anne would get, quote, small thanks either of God or of the world. How right he was. Of course, Boleyn would not have enjoyed such a dressing down, and it is perhaps little wonder that in the end Thomas was seemingly content to assist in Wolsey's downfall, which was sped along by the total failure of the trial after the case was recalled to Rome. He helped to assemble parliamentary charges against his former boss once Wolsey had completely lost the king's favour, and then, after the latter died in November 1530, Thomas had a farce performed for the French ambassador which depicted Wolsey's descent into hell. The ambassador did not appreciate the display, and again it showed a vindictive and nasty streak in Thomas's personality. And so we come to the 1530s, the decade in which the Boleyns would reach their peak power, only to almost all be dead by the end of it. That decade began for him with another diplomatic mission to Italy, Germany and France between January and August 1530. The idea was to try to assess support for the annulment from Charles V, the Pope and King Francis, though given that Charles was Queen Catherine's nephew and the Pope was under his thumb, support was rather thin on the ground, and Charles was very abrupt with Thomas. Supposedly, and this is according to John Foxe, who wrote the Book of Martyrs, so it's not a contemporary source, Thomas offended the Pope too by refusing to make the standard gesture of subservience of kissing his toe. Anne is famous for being an evangelical, not quite a Protestant as we understand it today, but a forerunner of them, and whether the toe-kissing story is true or not, her father's attitude to the papacy did evidently change during this period too, as he became more outspoken against Spanish and papal power the longer they stood in the way of his daughter and his king's plans. Eustace Chapuis, for instance, recorded a conversation with Wiltshire in October 1530, in which the Earl spoke so roughly of the Pope that Chapuis excused himself from the conversation, and he later called Thomas and Anne more Lutherans than Luther himself, though this is not necessarily accurate. Thomas didn't like papal power, but like Henry, he seems to have remained essentially Catholic otherwise. There are several instances of him interceding to protect, or try to protect, priests accused of wrongdoing from punishment, for instance, even when it set him at odds with his daughter and the king. Over the next couple of years, despite his apparent misgivings about his daughter's match with Henry, Wiltshire continued to promote it, at least outwardly, going with a contingent of counsellors to see Queen Catherine to try to persuade her to bend to the king's wishes in 1531, then swapping New Year's gifts with the king and spending time with Henry both for work and play. They gambled with each other quite a bit, for instance. He also continued his work in government, with, for example, his appointment as Lord Privy Seal, to being appointed to commissions of the peace for dozens of counties and negotiating a treaty with France in June 1532. That September, he witnessed Anne be created Marchioness of Pembroke in her own right, and on the 11th of October, he went with her and Henry to France for a meeting with King Francis, which lasted 5 weeks. It wouldn't be long now until Thomas found himself the father-in-law of the King of England and grandfather to its expected heir. When Henry and Anne married is not known for certain, but the date put forward most often is the 25th of January 1533, when she was already pregnant with Elizabeth, and Wiltshire was present for the ceremony according to Chapuis, along with Anne's mother and brother. The marriage, of which rumours circulated for some weeks, became officially public at Easter, and Wiltshire was one of its strongest supporters by this stage, despite the spats he had had with Anne that May, reported by Chapuis, in which she apparently complained that he had not always been in favour of it. Mind you, Chapuis and Wiltshire didn't really get along, so it's always worth taking the imperial ambassador's information with a grain of salt. You weren't likely to find him saying anything positive about a Boleyn. The Earl was his daughter's escort at her coronation that June, and in September he was at the christening of his new granddaughter, Princess Elizabeth. By the end of the year, Anne was pregnant again, with what would surely be a boy. Mary Boleyn was back at court for the New Year's celebrations, so presumably getting along better with her family, and despite the disappointment of Elizabeth's gender, everything was looking rosy. All that promise came to naught, though. Anne lost the baby in the summer of 1534. Mary contracted a second marriage to another unsuitable candidate, Sir William Stafford, that same year, which only came to light when her own pregnancy became obvious, and led Thomas to disown her, while Wiltshire himself was twice sent, with others, to Princess Mary, who was in the custody of his sister Alice, to try to get her to agree that her parents' marriage, which the Pope had finally found in favour of, was illegal. Twice, though, they failed. The year 1535 saw Wiltshire involved in the examinations, trials, and condemnations of some very famous Tudor-era figures, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More, due to their refusals to recognise the new religious settlement in England, which made King Henry the head of the Church instead of the Pope. After this, he spent more time back home at Hever Castle than at court. Bear in mind, he was in his late 50s by this point. In January 1536, Queen Catherine died, which Thomas apparently looked upon with glee, saying that it was just a shame that Princess Mary hadn't died too. Again, this shows a pretty nasty streak in his personality, but also a serious oversight in his understanding of his daughter's position, for with Catherine dead, Anne could now be cast aside without Henry having to go back to wife number one. And when Anne miscarried a boy at the end of that month and her lady-in-waiting Jane Seymour caught Henry's eye, that's exactly what happened. Probably Thomas couldn't have imagined just how bad the situation would get for his family that year, though. At first, despite the setback of the miscarriage, all seemed fine. Thomas and his son continued to be shown royal favour, being reconfirmed in land grants they already held, and the Earl was gifted the rents and property from the bishopric of Norwich as late as the 23rd of April, on which day he was also at a meeting of the Order of the Garter. 4 weeks later, his world lay in ruins. Anne was arrested on the 2nd of May and accused of treason and adultery with 5 men, all of whom were arrested too, including her brother George. They were sent to the Tower of London, and after show trials, all were condemned to death. George and the other men were executed on Tower Hill on the 17th of May, and Anne followed on the 19th, meeting her end within the Tower's walls before being buried next to her brother in the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. In one fell swoop, Thomas had lost 2 of his 3 children and his status as the king's father-in-law. Henry made sure to have the marriage to Anne annulled, even though it made no sense to accuse her of adultery if she'd never been his wife in the first place. Thomas did not see, or as far as we know write, to his doomed son and daughter during their imprisonments, nor was he present for their deaths. He was, however, placed on a commission alongside the likes of the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk and Thomas Cromwell that condemned the 4 commoners accused alongside his children, and Chapuis would write that on the day of Anne's death, "I am told the Earl of Wiltshire was quite as ready to assist at the judgment as he had done at the condemnation of the other 4. We don't know his source for that information, let alone if it was true, but I find it hard to believe that Thomas was expressing a desire to help to judicially murder his own children, though Anne's uncle Norfolk was present and condemned her. If he did say that he was willing to do the same, and that's a big if, we could look on it as a method of self-preservation. Knowing that his children were doomed, he saw that there was nothing to be gained by standing by them now. But equally, this might have just been a nasty rumour, and one of many floating around at that time. For instance, there were false stories, as reported by the Bishop of Faenza to Monsieur Ambrogio on the 24th of May, that Thomas and his wife had been imprisoned too, and that the Earl was present at Anne's sentencing. Other losses were to come. Thomas had to resign the position of Lord Privy Seal, which went to Cromwell, and the Ormond earldom, which had meant so much to him, was given back to Piers Butler in February 1538, though Thomas remained the Earl of Wiltshire. We have no records to tell us his thoughts on this whole situation. We know he'd had a difficult relationship with Anne at times during her affair with and marriage to Henry, but that doesn't mean he didn't love her. In happier times, he'd poured considerable energy and money into giving her the best education and opportunities that his income and connections could buy, and if he really had incurred her wrath by warning her and the king off their plans of marriage in the early days of their relationship, he'd been proved correct in his advice in the most tragic way possible. Furthermore, when it became clear that there was no stopping them from pursuing that course, he had travelled across Europe, enduring slights from the likes of Charles V, all in an effort to aid his child in obtaining her royal husband. We don't know what his relationship with George was, but at the very least there's nothing to suggest it was poor. Now, all he was left with was Mary, the daughter who until this stage had been the biggest disappointment and liability to the family, and with whom he seems to have had the worst relationship of the lot. He returned to Hever, and at the start of July was ordered to provide money to support his widowed daughter-in-law, Jane Parker Boleyn, which he said he was agreeing to only because the king had demanded it, and despite the fact that his financial situation was now much decayed. Clearly, there was no love lost there either, and if you want to know more about Jane's ultimate fate, spoiler alert, it wasn't good, I'll leave my episode on her death alongside Catherine Howard linked for you, along with another which explains why a Holbein drawing, sometimes said to be her, is most definitely not. That October, Thomas had to muster a troop of men and go to London to potentially help put down the rebels taking part in the Pilgrimage of Grace, but in the end he didn't need to travel any further north at that stage, though he was on a commission of peers the following May which condemned many of the insurgents. All the while, Cromwell and Henry continued to harass Wiltshire for money in the forms of rents and subsidies up until the autumn of 1537. That October, the Earl attended and took part in the baptism at Hampton Court Palace of Henry's longed-for boy, Prince Edward, born to Jane Seymour. The 4-year-old former Princess Elizabeth was there too, and this was the last time Thomas ever saw his grandchild by Anne. I don't generally like to put thoughts or words into the minds and mouths of historical figures, but I can't imagine that he didn't have an eye on Elizabeth for much of this ceremony, or that his thoughts weren't full of Anne as a result. By the by, his attendance at this event made him one of the few people to be present at all 3 of Henry's surviving and sometimes legitimate children's baptisms. Was he there, though, as a sign of rehabilitation, or was it a mark of Henry's cruelty to make his former father-in-law participate in the baptism of the child who had replaced little Elizabeth as the legitimate heir, and whose mother had replaced Anne? I'll let you decide. Perhaps, though, Thomas Boleyn felt a twinge of satisfaction when he found himself at Jane's funeral just a few weeks later, childbed fever having taken her only 12 days after Edward's arrival. There was not now much of Lord Wiltshire's life left, and most of what there was spent at Hever, though he was at court for New Year 1538 and travelled with Henry and his entourage that August. In the meantime, his wife Elizabeth had died in April, possibly from TB, though Thomas's mother was, believe it or not, still alive, though she was deemed a mental invalid from 1519 onwards. As 1539 dawned, he sent Prince Edward a New Year's gift in one of the last actions we are aware of by him. On the 12th of March, he died at Hever, and was buried in its little church in a fairly impressive-looking tomb. He was about 62 years old, and King Henry paid for masses to be said for his former father-in-law's soul. He left 400 marks a year to his mother, but comparatively little to his daughter Mary, though she ended up inheriting much of the Boleyn property from her grandmother within the year and died very wealthy in 1543. Other landholdings were bequeathed to his granddaughter Elizabeth. With no male heir anymore, lands inherited from his father went to his brother James, though Jane Parker Boleyn was able to keep Blickling until her own death in 1542. Hever Castle was bought by the Crown and would later be given to Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Thomas's story, then, is one of triumph and tragedy. Through his own hard work, he rose up the ranks at the court of Henry VIII, acquiring titles and money along the way. Had Henry never met Anne, her father would probably be remembered as a successful courtier and ambassador who lived a life of service to the crown, was well educated and travelled, and had some family problems with his wayward daughter Mary, but little else. Instead, his life took a tragic turn, as Anne's misfortune brought down her brother and severely undermined all that her father had worked for. Does he deserve his posthumous reputation as a grasping parent who pushed his daughters into Henry VIII's arms only to turn his back on them once the king was finished with them? Personally, I think not. He was no angel, of course, and I certainly think he could have been kinder to Mary, but there is little evidence that he wished his daughters to become mistresses of the king, and strong evidence from Anne's own mouth that the opposite was true. Furthermore, Thomas doesn't seem to have had the mindset for the kind of Machiavellian schemes that such a plot would have entailed, and it appears that he was being carried along by events under Anne and Henry's control rather than the other way around. Still, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on him, so let me know in the comments if you think Thomas Boleyn was a bad father or not. If you've enjoyed this episode, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and subscribe to the channel to get more from me. You can also join my YouTube membership for some extra perks, or my Patreon for even more bonuses, including early access to ad-free videos and bonus podcasts. For some free extras, join my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, to get access to 2 complimentary downloads plus my newsletter. It's linked below for you. For more on the Boleyn family, I recommend you try either my episode on the supposed portraits of Thomas and George, or my episode on Anne's famous bee necklace. If you're not sure what you'd like, click on my playlist on Anne for a list of options. That's all for now, and till next time, folks, keep learning.